Perfect. All right. Welcome to our Monday forms training. We may have to revisit changing times or days on this one due to low attendance, but we won't talk about that today. We are working through our documents that are attached to our listing agreements. Last quarter, we talked about all of the buyer-related or offer-related documents. So this quarter, we're working through our listing related documents. So the next one that we have in our queue is our key safe lockbox addendum and tenant permission to access the property. It's a KLA form. It was revised back in June of 23, so about a year ago. They did some revisions for that. And we need this form anytime we have a listing that's going to go on the market that is inhabited by anybody but the seller of the property, the legally recognized seller. So seller's family is living in the property, seller is not. We need this form. That would be tenant occupied. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's really important that we identify who's considered a tenant versus who is not, so that we use the appropriate forms in the appropriate manner. And that is absolutely one of the ways that we do that is the only person that is not considered a tenant is the seller on the title to the property. So now if the seller and his wife or seller and his kids or seller and his aunt and uncle or his friend or whoever is renting a room, that's totally fine as long as the seller is occupying the property. But if the seller does not live in that property, then it's considered tenant occupied. Let's say the seller and his wife split. The seller's name is the one on title, not the wife's. They're divorced. Seller no longer lives there. The wife is now considered a tenant, just for the record. So we would need to make sure we check that box on our listing agreement for the key safe lockbox addendum. It'll automatically add this form to your transaction. And then you're going to use this form. And this form is going to give permission for us as the agent to be able to utilize a key safe, right? The key box, right? On here, it also talks about the access and protection of the property. It gives us permission from the tenants to be able to access the property and be able to show the property. So super important form. There's a separate form, just so you know, for the signage, but this one's for that lockbox and access. So the undersigned seller and, if applicable, housing provider, that's the housing provider is really what was updated back last June. But that's just the seller of the property, the owner. Okay. They've entered into an agreement with, we're going to put the brokerage name there on that next line, and then dated, that's the date that's on the listing agreement in the upper left-hand corner of the first page of that listing agreement. To market for sale, lease, or rent the real property located at, and you're going to put the full property address there, number, street. Make sure you put that suffix, road, street, drive, court, way, whatever it might be, city, state, and zip code. Okay, that's the top section. Section number 1, disclosures regarding access and protection of property. A key safe lockbox is designed to hold a key to the above property, permitting access to the interior of the property by broker, other brokers, and real estate licensees who are participants of the MLS service, MLS, authorized appraisers and inspectors, and accompanied persons interested in purchasing, leasing, or renting the property. These individuals may take videos or photographs of the property. The broker does not have the ability to control or block the taking and use of images by any such persons. 1B is the MLS rules require a key safe lockbox to be placed on the property to be an MLS approved access device in accordance with the rules of the MLS to which the listing has been submitted. Generally, an MLS approved access device is one that is specifically authorized by the MLS or where use of it provides reasonable and timely access to listed property in accordance with the standards required by the MLS. Just so you know, in case you're like, Amy, what does that mean? It means those Bluetooth lock boxes. It's not talking about combo lock boxes. Those are technically not MLS approved. If you put the combo lockbox in those private comments, you're going to get a violation notice, just for the record, especially if it's in the Metro List area. They're really keen on that. So you're supposed to have the blue lockbox. People are supposed to have access to that. I know a lot of agents put both the blue lockbox and what we call a contractor's box or a combo box on that property. But when it comes to a tenant occupied property, they're authorizing us to put on a MLS approved lockbox, which is the blue lockbox. They are not authorizing us to put those contractor boxes on there. So just kind of keep that in mind. C is broker, cooperating brokers, and other real estate licensees. The MLS and associations / boards of realtor are not insurers against injury, theft, loss, vandalism, damage, or other harm, whether access is a result of the use of the key safe lockbox or by other means. Broker does not maintain insurance to protect the owner or other occupants. Broker recommends the owner and, if applicable, tenant and other occupants of the property maintain insurance and take all possible precautions and safeguards to protect themselves, other occupants, and visitors, their property and belongings, including cash, jewelry, drugs, firearms, and other valuables located on the property. So that's section 1, the disclosure regarding access and protection of property. We're just outlining what we cover. Generally speaking, if they have a renter's policy in place, that's generally going to cover that liability insurance for people visiting the property, and it's going to cover their possessions of the property. Okay, the landlord policy also has some coverage on there, and that's going to be also, it usually has some liability, but it's mainly like for fire damage or that type of thing. 2 is owner permission for use of a key safe lockbox. Owner hereby authorizes broker to use a key safe lockbox. If the property is tenant occupied, owner is advised that tenant permission may be required and is recommended. Owner acknowledges a receipt of a copy of this document. Here's where you're going to put the owner's name. So seller 1 and seller 2 would go there on those lines. They're also going to sign them. So date, sign, and then their printed name. Section 2. Section 3 is the tenant permission to access the premises. I am the current tenant of the above referenced property, and I've read the disclosure statements above. In addition to any authority granted in the lease or rental agreement, I agree as follows. Broker may use a key safe lockbox, and broker may show the property as follows. Right? The third option down there is for single family dwellings. Broker may post a for sale, for lease, for rent, or sold sign on the property. We've just gotten the permission from the tenant to be able to do all 3 of those things if we check those boxes. So if we want to use a key safe lockbox, we check that box that says broker may use a key safe lockbox. Just so you know too, it states here that in addition to any authority granted in the lease or rental agreement, right, most leases or rental agreements, assuming they have an official one in place, do authorize the owner of the premises to be able to access it with 24-hour notice for the purpose of showing the property. So that's usually covered in that lease agreement, but we're just stating again as follows, and this is in addition to that. So we're not changing the terms of their lease agreement. We're saying, hey, in addition, we're going to use a lockbox. Broker may show the property as follows. Usually if it's tenant occupied, like an official tenancy is in that property, it's usually 24-hour notice. So I would usually fill that in. 24-hour notice via text is usually what I would fill in there. So that they've authorized that, hey, text notification, or you could put text / phone, that either of those notifications would be appropriate. Hopefully the tenant's on board with selling the property and they're cooperating. There are instances where the tenant just isn't going to cooperate. You still can technically, per the lease agreement, show the property, usually with 24 hours notice, but sometimes that could hinder you more than it helps you. So you may need to talk with your seller at that time if they're not cooperative about the best means to be able to get that property on the market and sold. But here's where you would fill in those instructions. So don't just check this box and leave this blank. Fill something in here that the tenant's going to agree to as far as showing instructions. Okay. And then the third option down here, also keep in mind too, that if the tenants or the owner's family lives in the property, oftentimes they don't have an actual lease or rental agreement in place. So there's no authority in that lease or rental agreement for access. So it's also important that we spell it out there. And then the third box there is for single family dwellings. Broker may post a for sale, for lease, for rent, or sold sign on that property. So you can check that box as well. Okay, and then what happens is the tenant acknowledges a receipt and a copy of the document. The tenant name goes here, down here, the printed name, and then they're going to sign and date here. If there's more than one tenant, they would sign and date there. And the tenant would be the person listed on that lease or rental agreement. So there might be 2 or 3 people living in that property, but the one that actually signed the lease agreement is the one that signs the KLA form. Questions about this KLA form? Usually, just so you know too, if I am selling a property that is tenant occupied, I like to have a conversation with that tenant of what their plans are and to try to help them move forward. It just helps the process to go a little smoother. So I don't act like in a agency capacity for them, but I may kick them over some rentals, or if I hear of rentals available, if they're looking for another rental, I may kick that to them. Maybe we find out that they want to buy, but they don't want to buy that house. And then you could take them on as a buyer client, right? So there's some options there. So I do usually like to have a conversation with them so that they feel like I'm working with them for the success of not just the transaction, but their living situation, versus just kind of coming at it and being like, well, sorry, we're giving you notice, you've got to be out, and we're going to start showing the property. So it's all in how you approach the tenants in these situations. All right, so that's your key safe lockbox addendum, tenant permission to access property. Also includes that permission for putting that sign in their yard. Again, we want to put that sign in every yard that we have a listing for because it is our marketing crutch, right, for that property. And we want to generate leads from our listings. So we need to make sure that we have that for sale sign in the yard. All right, that's the end. That's all I had covered for today, but I did want to also bring your attention to one other thing on a different form before we wrap up today. On our BRBC form, so our broker representation and buyer compensation form. I know you guys you feel like we're hitting you over the head with this, but that's because we need to use it for every single buyer from the very beginning. But they did add a new attachment to that form. They've snuck it in there. So I just wanted to make sure you guys were all aware of this additional form that was added. You know how they stack all the beginning with the agency forms and the fair housing form. And then you've got your PRBS all coming up, in the wire fraud, all coming up to that BRBC form. All those forms need to be included. Now they've also included what we call a broker compensation advisory. Okay, this came out this month. It's a May 24 form. So in case you ever wonder, like, when did they add this form? Or this seems like it's got changes. When did that happen? At the top of the form, this is the BCA form. It says 5/24. That means this form was either revised or instituted in May of 2024, which is this month. So I just wanted to bring your attention to it. Let's look through this form real quick. It's just a one-page form, and it talks about how compensation happens in a real estate transaction. When sellers list their property for sale through a real estate broker, they agree to pay the seller's broker when escrow closes. The seller may also authorize the seller's broker to share compensation with a buyer's broker, or may agree to directly pay the buyer's broker. Listing agreement compensation is negotiable. When a seller enters into a listing agreement with a broker, the seller authorizes the broker to find a buyer for the seller's property and agrees to pay the seller's broker if a buyer is found who purchases the property. Compensation amounts are not fixed by law, but are instead negotiable between the seller and the seller's broker. When negotiating compensation, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker services to be performed, and the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. If the seller approves a listing agreement, may authorize the seller's broker to share part of that broker's compensation with the broker who represents the buyer. And the amount the seller broker agrees to pay the buyer's broker will be incorporated into the overall compensation the seller is obligated to pay the seller's broker. Just so you know, too, I haven't looked, but my guess is you're going to see this form pop up with your listing agreement as well. It's going to be on both the BRBC and that listing agreement. So just a heads up on that. Offering compensation to a buyer's broker is negotiable. Seller and seller's brokers are not required by law or otherwise to offer compensation to a buyer's broker. The promise of payment from the seller's broker to the buyer's broker may lead to a quicker and more efficient transaction because knowing the overall cost of broker compensation at the time the listing allows a seller to more easily calculate the seller's net proceeds when evaluating offers and counteroffers. The seller's property may become more attractive to buyers who need a loan to finance the purchase price, since buyers who may have limited. Try that again. Since buyers, brokers' compensation would be paid from the seller's proceeds at time of closing rather than out of pocket by the buyer who may have limited funds. Many buyers have limited funds after paying deposit, down payment, property inspection costs, and other closing costs. These buyers may be more likely to write an offer for the seller's property if they are able to effectively finance the buyer broker compensation into the cost of their loan rather than coming up with additional funds. By making the seller's property attractive to all buyers, regardless of their ability to directly pay a buyer's broker, the pool of prospective buyers for the seller's property will likely increase. 3 is offering compensation to a buyer's broker allows the seller to inform brokers representing prospective buyers that they can rely on an efficient payment of their compensation without adding to the buyer's closing costs. An offer of compensation from the seller's broker to the buyer's broker is optional. A seller may instruct the seller's broker to offer no such compensation. In the listing agreement, an amendment, the seller instructs the seller's broker whether to offer any compensation to the buyer's broker, and if so, how much. Okay, anybody have questions about section 1 of the new BCA form?
You know, what's interesting on there is B3, when you just talked about in the amendment, in the listed agreement or amendment. So the offer for compensation in an amendment could change. Interesting to see where that shift would happen if they did make that. I mean, at what point are they obligated, the seller, to actually pay that, what they've agreed?
Yeah, and my guess is, and I feel like it probably should have been like listing agreement, maybe a modification of terms.
Yeah.
Seller instructs the seller's broker whether to offer any, but it does say amendment there. My guess is it could come into play, like maybe they initially offer some and maybe they do an amendment not to, because they have to do a price reduction below what they're willing to take, and that helps to help their bottom line to stay the same. But yeah, there's lots of changes that could happen in the middle of that listing period. Keep in mind too that as a buyer's broker or buyer's agent, we can negotiate with that BRBC in place. We can use the SPBB form and negotiate directly with the seller for our compensation. So if it's something the buyer's going to have to come out of pocket for because the seller's not offering it, we can directly negotiate with part of our offer, that SPBB form, to negotiate with the seller for compensation. I would think we're going to see more and more sellers that are willing to offer compensation, but maybe they don't offer it up front as part of the actual listing, thinking, well, if the buyer's willing to pay it, why would I pay it? But if they ask for me to pay it, I'm willing to also pay it there too. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out over time. But there are some more options available to our sellers. All right. Section 2, buyer's broker compensation arrangements. In California, a buyer representation agreement is recommended and required in certain circumstances, which may limit the amount a buyer's broker may be paid to the amount in the agreement. Buyers and their brokers benefit when the terms of their relationship and respective duties are written, because expressed written terms, hold on, I just lost that line. Expressed written terms establish mutual expectations and help avoid misunderstandings over buyer and broker duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agent expects to be paid. Denise, I agree. We're still seeing oftentimes sellers are still offering compensation. I don't think that's going to change a whole lot, but we are seeing that. Many sellers, 2B is many sellers authorize their brokers to often offer compensation to the buyer's broker in the listing agreement. This may be used to offset the obligation a buyer has under the buyer representation agreement. C is a buyer's broker should communicate with the buyer about how the broker will be paid for their work in representing the buyer. And D is in the absence of a buyer representation agreement, if the compensation offered to the buyer's broker from third parties is insufficient to meet the expectation of the buyer's broker, and the buyer's broker is unable, prior to drafting an offer on behalf of the buyer, to reach an agreement with the seller or seller's broker to be paid an amount the broker deems adequate, buyer's brokers are not obligated to represent the buyer. You can just abandon your buyer. That's sad. Any questions about section 2? All right. Section 3, methods for buyer's broker to obtain compensation. Buyer pays the compensation directly through a buyer representation agreement. Buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation expected directly with the buyer, who may choose to simply pay their own agent. B is seller pays the compensation. Buyer negotiates for seller to pay buyer's obligation under a buyer's representation agreement. A buyer may negotiate a term in the purchase agreement asking the seller to pay the obligation they have already agreed to pay their own agent in a buyer representation agreement. This option should be discussed when creating a buyer representation agreement and prior to the offer being made. Buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with seller. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency relationship with another agent, a buyer's agent may approach that seller to obtain a single party compensation agreement where the seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker's compensation without necessarily creating an agency relationship. We covered that form a couple weeks ago, just so everybody knows if you want to watch that recording. And then seller's agent pays the compensation to buyer's agent would be option number 3. Just so you know, it says buyer negotiates, sorry, we're backing up to B1. Buyer negotiates for seller to pay buyer's obligation under a buyer representation agreement. That would be the SPBB form. We're not talking about the seller and the buyer having a conversation. You're representing the buyer. They're having a conversation directly with the seller. We're going to negotiate it as part of the buyer's offer to the seller, and that's going to be generally used using that SPBB form. Okay. Then C is the agent pays the compensation to buyer's agent. A seller may have authorized the seller's broker to offer a compensation to the buyer's broker in the listing agreement. The buyer's agent may want to inquire with the seller's agent about whether they have such authorization. The seller's agent and buyer's agent can enter into a cooperating broker compensation agreement where the seller's broker agrees to compensate the buyer's broker. Questions about 3?
I have a little issue with the SPBB.
Yes.
I just had one come across and they were negotiating the commission, and it just seems like you have you have the buyer, you have the seller, and we shouldn't be party to that conversation or the negotiation part of it. That's it seemed like it's done wrong.
It's done wrong. Yeah, I agree. And the SPBB form is not my favorite form. I think for the most part, if they're not offering a compensation that would cover what's going to get paid in the BRBC, for the most part, I would probably negotiate that as a closing cost credit to the buyer versus doing it any other way, because it just, the way that it's going to get perceived, I think is going to be better in the long run. And then you use your buyer representation agreement to the title company and to the lender to show that that credit is to cover the obligation under the BRBC.
Right. I like that actually.
Yeah. The SPBB form, it's there. We're authorized to use it. It's not my favorite, and it just seems funky.
I also think though there's a standard of conduct. I think it's either 10 or 13 for our ethics. And when bringing in our commission into that conversation, you dance on the line with ethics violation. And I mean, obviously, if they have the form, it's not an ethics violation, but it just seems like it's very easy for it to go a bad direction.
Yeah, I agree. And it also becomes are you like, okay, well, we've signed a BRBC and we're supposed to get compensated. But if we're trying to negotiate up our commission, let's say they're offering 1% or 1.5%, and we're trying to get it to 2.5% or 3%, are we really looking out for the buyer's best interest, especially in a multiple offer situation? Like the chances of your offer getting accepted go down, I feel like, significantly once we start trying to throw that in the mix as well. And then it becomes this whole issue of, are we really looking out for the best interest of the buyer and all those things that come along with that?
I think that's going to get shaken out here in the next 6 months to 2 years.
Yep, I agree. And I think for the most part, I think things are probably going to continue on as they have. And I think this form helps to draw that case for the sellers, for the fact that, hey, you don't have to, it's negotiable, but here's why you may want to. And this form helps us to kind of justify that. Denise, you said that the form's confusing to you. Are you able to unmute yourself and elaborate?
It's just a lot of, I don't know. It just seems confusing to me. I know Edge went over this with us too before. There's a lot of seller doing this, buyer doing that. I don't know. It just seems really too much going on there.
I agree.
Can't just the buyer's broker thing? Isn't that just, doesn't that take care of this?
Well, this form's now attached to that. So yeah, it does, but this outlines, because the whole lawsuit was that sellers were not told clearly that they had options for negotiating the commission and that they were forced to pay commission to the buyer's agents. And so this form clarifies to all parties that there's no forcing anybody to do anything, that here are your options. I do agree that I think it could have been better utilized. I think this was the jump to a conclusion kind of CYA form for the Association of Realtors to make sure that there's a form in our documents, in our 50 documents that we have to send out for signature that outlines that it's negotiable. Nobody's being forced into anything. Here's why you might want to. Here's why you may not want to. As a buyer, here's your options of being represented, not being represented, being compensated. So I think it's kind of that form. I think probably over the next 6 months to a year, they're going to flesh out these forms a little bit better. Probably some major changes. It almost feels like they should have two separate forms, one that goes with the listing that talks directly to the sellers and one that goes with the BRBC that talks directly with buyers. And this one is a little too cyclical.
It's too much information. Can you just say, seller, you don't have to pay compensation to the buyer?
Yeah. And so I think, if I was presenting this with my BRBC, which again, it's attached to the BRBC, so it's one of those forms that we now have to include. If I was sending this out to be signed and wanted to summarize it, I would just let the buyer know that, hey, buyer, just so you know, we're signing this. There's going to be a percentage on that BRBC form that you're ultimately responsible for. But before we submit an offer on a property, I'll let you know kind of where it sits, and we can have a conversation when we get ready to submit that offer of how to take care of any shortfalls or how we're going to look at that and just move forward from there.
Okay. That's simple at explaining that. I'm making it as simple as possible.
Yeah, right. Amanda, the name of this form is the BCA, the Broker Compensation Advisory. It's now attached to the BRBC. So it's
okay. So when you go to get a BRBC, it'll be just in all of them. Cool. Awesome.
Yep. It's just page 8 of 14 of the BRBC now.
Oh, yay.
It's part of those, pre-forms.
That's good though. I like it attaches.
Yeah.
I don't forget anything.
You don't have to remember it. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on this BCA form? I appreciate that all the BRBC forms that are associated, it's the BCA form, the ABCD form, they're all, the beginning of the alphabet. All right, fabulous. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I appreciate it. Make sure you log your attendance in the chat box. There's a link to do that. If there's any trainings you would like to see coming up in the summer or fall series, make sure to throw that in the suggestions box. And tomorrow we will be talking about writing and getting offers accepted on our Rev Up series. Oh, and then Wednesday, mark your calendars. We got Lisa Visa is bringing in a 1031 exchange expert. So Russell Marzin, he's actually with a third-party company, IPX, that handles 1031 exchange. So he'll be there to talk all about 1031 exchanges, answer any questions that you may have, just kind of clear up any confusion that you have, and maybe talk about ways that we can help market that to pick up investor clients and help them to utilize that tax umbrella appropriately. That's Wednesday. All right. We will see you all tomorrow at 11 a.m.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.